Hello and welcome to TCNJ Decision 2020. We have two young Democrats and two young Republicans joining us to discuss various aspects of the 2020 general election. The format of this discussion is a roundtable and is not a formal debate. The goal of this discussion is to inform our fellow TCNJ students on issues surrounding the election. The following opinions are those of the persons appearing in the program and do not represent the views of Lions Television, its executive board, the College Democrats, the College Republicans, the TCNJ Debate Club, or the College of New Jersey. So I'd like to welcome Yanni, the president of the TCNJ College Democrats, Dave, the president of the College Democrats of New Jersey, representing the Young Democrats, Chris, a Republican political science major, and Tyler, a right-leaning political science major representing Young Republicans. We will start a discussion today with what Young Democrats and Republicans believe is the most important issue facing Americans this election season, especially for young Americans such as ourselves. Yanni, what do you think?
Thanks for having us on here, Faris, first of all. I think the most important issue facing Americans this election is the coronavirus. It's hard to look at anything that's not the global pandemic going on right now. I believe that this is the biggest issue because of how long it's gone on, how much the president has played it down, and how much inaction has been taken. Americans have to view this election as essentially how this pandemic is going to affect us in the future. You know, looking at over 200,000 Americans dead from the coronavirus, we have to look at it and see, how are we going to solve this pandemic? Right now, I don't think that the president is taking action to solve it. I mean, the death toll definitely backs that, but I think that's the biggest issue facing Americans right now.
Dave, do you have anything to add?
I would agree with Yanni. The statistics don't lie. 8 million people have tested positive in the US for COVID-19. 226,000 people have died. COVID-19 affects businesses. It also affects basic public health. If we all have to wear masks around for the next year, that's going to continue to damage businesses, and people are going to be less likely to go out and shop if there are restrictions on how many people can be in restaurants. And certainly we don't think, I think I can speak for Yanni and myself, that COVID-19 has been adequately addressed. And so that's going to be on voters' minds.
Chris, what is your response? You feel the same or a different opinion?
I personally think that the economy is, specifically the economy is a more pressing issue because of how bad of a position we are in currently with the economy. There's millions unemployed, and just the infighting between Democrats and Republicans on congressional floor, and being unwilling to pass further legislation to give millions of Americans unemployment benefits has been really affecting people, and that's, I think, the biggest issue on people's minds currently.
Tyler, do you agree, or do you have a different
So I don't think anyone here actually disagrees. I think these issues are one and the same, right? Because the coronavirus exists, and because of the coronavirus, we've seen a downfall of the economy. So to fix one, you need to fix the other. I think in 2021, it doesn't matter who's president, because the vaccine process is going to take the same amount of time. No president can speed it up or slow it down. It's just how fast scientists around the world work, and these different companies work together. But the more that I kind of agree with Chris in that in 2021, we need to kind of emphasize the economy, because at the end of the day, when we have a vaccine and we start to, fix what's happened because of the coronavirus, we're still going to be left with this broken economy, and we're going to need a plan to fix it. And I really think that's going to impact the future of America. The economy is what's going to lead us into our the next generation of Americans. It's gonna, and we need to help these revitalize these small businesses, and we can't do that without fixing the coronavirus first. But we also can't forget about the economy at the same time. We have to keep working and fixing both of them at the same time. We can't just say, oh, we're going to focus on the coronavirus, oh, we're going to focus on the economy. No, you need to do both simultaneously, or else you just don't have an America, right? You don't fix anything if you don't fix both of them.
I think that was a good wrap up of what the biggest issue is. So it looks like for both of you, or in general, it's the pandemic and the economy. LTV polled 160 TCNJ students, and it found that half of TCNJ students see the pandemic as the biggest issue facing Americans. But I think Tyler was right to say all of the problems that we're facing, whether it be like race relations or the economy or climate change, are being affected by the pandemic and are being worsened by it. So let's actually turn our attention to the coronavirus itself, just because we've been talking about it a little bit. So Chris and Tyler, what do you guys think about the response to the coronavirus? Was it too little? Was it too much? Was it just right? And both at the federal and state level, what is your take on that? Chris, we'll start with you.
So I think that I'll take the state first, or I'll take the federal first. I think that in terms of what President Trump has done, I think it has been pretty adequate in that he imposed a travel ban on China in January before the first case of the virus spread in the U.S. While many Democrat politicians ridiculed him for this, including former Vice President Joe Biden and Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. He also has imposed Operation Warp Speed, which is a program helping to create a vaccine hopefully by the end of the year, and will hopefully be fully distributed by the end of 2021. He's also signed the CARES Act, which has expanded unemployment aid to millions of Americans, which has been able to help them keep paying their rents and putting food on the table. In terms of more state-run responses, that in our federal system, it's more of the responsibility of states to figure out what sort of restrictions that they want to impose. It's not really the federal government's job to impose national lockdowns or mask mandates or anything like that. So that's all lands on the responsibility of individual governors. I think that more Republican-leaning states have done a better job, and we can see this in terms of the death tolls. Some of the highest states with the highest death tolls have been more Democrat-run states, such as New York and California.
Tyler, what do you have to say? Anything different? Anything the same?
I do have a different opinion. Like I said, I'm right-leaning, so my views with President Trump aren't necessarily, we don't exactly like concur with each other. But I think the fact that we have this issue where we can say President Trump downplayed the coronavirus, it's just inherently an issue. How does that happen? How can you say that the President of the United States downplayed a pandemic and has now costed, over 200,000 deaths in America? How can we say that's adequate at all? If we wanted adequacy, we would have seen President Trump wearing a mask in March. You have to display leadership, and a display of leadership in a pandemic is wearing a mask and showing Americans the right way to do things. Because to my knowledge, President Trump really didn't start wearing a mask until, the summer, when the press and even Republicans and Democrats came together and were like, all right, what are you doing? I will agree with Chris in that there are definitely plans in place. There are definitely programs to create the vaccine and to kind of help Americans throughout this process. However, I can't get past the fact that we've witnessed over 200,000 deaths in America and just so many more, ill and still suffering from the coronavirus. If we're going to go from the federal level, I don't think the federal response was very good. I think the initial employment checks, they were good. I don't know why we're stopping that, because we're still facing the same issues. Nothing has changed except maybe less cases from June to now. There really isn't a significant difference. State numbers are going up. New Jersey's numbers are going up again. We're not doing much differently. We just kind of went down, and now we're going to see an upward trend again. So that means we need to put the initial programs back in place now. For the state level, I think it really depends. I think, yes, Chris can argue that the death toll in New York is worse than the death toll in Florida. But I also want you to keep in mind that New York was the first state to get coronavirus with no ventilators, with no resources. They had no ways to prepare for these deaths. And Florida, on the other hand, got the coronavirus later. A few months later is when their numbers started to spike, when they had access to all these resources because the government was providing them. And obviously, as a result, their death number will be lower, but their case number is higher. How is that good? You don't want more people walking around with a disease. That's not beneficial to America. You want each state to have equality. You want low numbers throughout the entirety of the country. And the fact that that just hasn't happened because people can't agree to wear masks, they can't agree to stay inside, they can barely agree not to go to school for maybe a year. It's kind of ridiculous. And the fact that the federal government has caused so much controversy with something that just seems so obvious is that it's astounding. It's not a good reputation that America should have. We should be the front runner in all of these issues. We should be creating the vaccine. We should be showing a good example for the rest of the world, and we haven't managed to do that. We've managed to embarrass ourselves.
Very passionate. Love the passion. All right, let's move it over to the Democrats. What do you have to say about the federal and state response to the coronavirus?
Well, I think Tyler and Chris probably spoke at length about the state and the federal government's response. I think I'm just going to focus on the state's response. A year ago, Phil Murphy, to 1 in 5 voters in New Jersey, voters didn't have an opinion of him. So you're talking about a year ago, 20% of voters in New Jersey didn't even have an opinion of Phil Murphy. This year, in April, we saw that 70% of New Jerseyans approved of how Phil Murphy was doing in his role as governor. Now, later on in June, after all these executive orders that some Republicans have called infringements on liberty, and you see, say, gym owners on YouTube and on CNN claiming that their gyms should be able to open like there isn't a global pandemic. Independently of all that, independently of all these executive orders, when you ask voters in New Jersey how they feel about Governor Murphy's handling of COVID-19, 84% of Democrats have supported his handling of the pandemic, and 43% of Republicans have also done the same. Why are they doing it? Well, because from day one, he was clear on what was going on. Wear a mask, practice social distancing. If you don't have to go to work, don't go to work. If you can go to work online and work remotely, you should do that. If you're an essential worker, you should practice the basic public health tips that people were putting out from day one. The federal government's response, while I think President Donald Trump accepts some responsibility for it, federal legislators, Republicans and Democrats, also should accept some of the blame. Certainly, we're not just focused on what President Trump is doing, but how is COVID-19 relief gotten to regular people and businesses? That's what we should be focusing on. And when we look at it, I think by and large that they've done a very good job across the board.
Thank you for that. What about you, Yanni? What do you think?
There's a couple different aspects to look at when it comes to federal and state government action when it comes to the coronavirus. To start with the federal level, you have a president who essentially is mocking this global pandemic. It came out that he told Bob Woodward that he knew it was deadly back in February before all this started, but he didn't want to scare people. For me, that's an excuse. He's been playing it down. He hasn't been wearing a mask. Another issue, especially when it comes to the economy that both of you said before, is that when states ask for federal aid to support their people, for example, New Jersey, doesn't have to do with the president. Mitch McConnell said, file for bankruptcy. To me, that's not how, especially during this time in a global pandemic, you help the people in this country. When it comes to the state level, when you look at what Phil Murphy did, he took some of the most drastic measures for the coronavirus. When the cases were going down after the initial spike, New Jersey was one of those top 3 states that had the highest percentage of cases dropping in the country. I think he's been taking the most drastic measures, the measures needed in order to take the correct action on this coronavirus.
All right, so let's move on to approval ratings. So all of you mentioned Donald Trump's response to the pandemic, with varying opinions, of course. And according to 538, as of October 21st, 39.7 approve of the president's response to the pandemic, while 57.4 disapprove of his response. Additionally, when LTV did our poll, we found that only 8% of respondents approve, while 82% disapprove. And obviously, That's skewed. It's just from TCNJ students. But as I said before, there is a large difference between those who approve of his response and those who disapprove. So let's move on to President Trump's own approval rating. So his approval rating has never gone above 50% on average. There has been some polls that have seen him go above 50, but in general, on average, it's been under 50. And our TCNJ poll, or poll of TCNJ students rather, found that 79% disapprove of him, which is much higher than the national average. So right now, President Trump's approval rating hovers around 44.4%, according to realclearpolitics.com. So how are approval ratings going to affect this race? Is this going to fuel Democrats to have another wave as we saw in 2018, or is it going to solidify Trump's base to say we can't let them win? Let's start with the Democrats this time.
I mean, I think the approval rating just goes to show that people who voted for Trump in 2016, President Trump, excuse me, wanted an outsider. They didn't want, a traditional politician. They felt they were being, maybe lied to or taken advantage of by these people in Washington. But they realized it didn't really work. You have a guy that's basically been lying his way through his 4 years as president, and his approval rating just goes to show. I mean, not even going over 50% approval is an issue. You have the leader of the free world who doesn't even have the full support of his country or even half the support of his country. I think that goes to show that people are starting to realize that things are going on that they're not approving of, and there needs to be a big change.
Well, I think it's a really interesting and important question, which is why haven't Trump's approval ratings exceeded 50%? And I think Yanni did a good job of outlining why. What's really interesting is no president since FDR, besides George W. Bush, has won re-election as an incumbent with fewer than 50% of voters polled supporting him or the incumbent president. So what we have to look at is why is that the case? Why haven't voters, at least in recent weeks, been doing that, changing their opinion of him leading up to the election? That's the case of George W. Bush. In leading up to the election, voters changed their mind, and they changed, in many cases, their perception of him, and his approval rating went above 50%. We haven't seen Trump's approval ratings do that. And in fact, they've been going down recently. So why is that the case? Well, I would say that it's President Trump's poor handling of COVID-19. If he had handled it better, perhaps he would have been like President Obama after the 2008 stimulus package. Obama's approval ratings were, exceeding 60%. If we're looking at George W. Bush's handling of 9/11, his approval ratings were close to 90%. You look at Clinton during the 1998 financial crisis throughout Asia, his approval ratings were around 70%. Why are we seeing President Trump's approval rating, to your point, Ferris, around 40%? Well, it's his handling of COVID-19.
We heard from the Democrats. Let's hear from the Republicans. Tyler, what do you have to say about Trump's approval rating? How do you think that it's going to affect this race?
Okay, so I want to just kind of add to what David kind of said. So if we're going to talk about approval ratings, yeah, like George W. Bush had a 90% approval rating after 9/11, right? But by the end of his term, the average was like 49, and Obama's by the end of his term was 47. You don't see these many you don't see presidents in recent history having an average approval rating above 50%. I don't actually think approval ratings at this point in time for the election play a significant role. Yanni kind of hit that nail on the head, particularly because Trump's base is Trump's base. Trump's base is not going to leave Trump. What matters is whether or not independent voters go to Trump, or whether or not Democratic voters actually vote. And at the end of the day, that's what's going to, solidify the election. I don't think the approval ratings really play a huge role in whether or not he gets elected, because everyone sees Trump for Trump. He's pretty face value. You know what you're getting when you vote for Trump. There's no secrets being kept. The one thing you can say about Trump is he's very forward. You might not know his intentions, but you kind of know what he's thinking because he always tweets. People know what they're getting when they vote for Trump. So if you're not going to vote for Trump, you know that. But these people who are in the air, you really can't tell. And that's what's going to, determine the election.
So Tyler, you're saying that independent voters are going to decide it. It's not going to be partisans who already disagree with Trump. Chris, what do you have to say about that? Do you agree?
I agree in some part, and especially with like how approval ratings, I don't think are going to be the deciding factor in this election. Because for one thing, in whether or not you agree with the binary choice that we have had in every election since this country's founding, um, if somebody could disapprove of the way that President Trump is running the country, but they could also or they could disapprove more of how they think the vice president is going to handle it if he does come into office. So with that, they also if somebody does disapprove of Donald Trump and how he's handled the country, that also doesn't mean that they are going to go out and they have the enthusiasm to go out and to vote against him. So it all just boils down to who is going to go out and to vote.
So the Democrats are saying it's important, or more important, it shows that he hasn't done a great job, but the Republicans are saying it doesn't matter if Trump still keeps his base. So we'll see, but let's talk about voter enthusiasm, because that's really what's going to determine whether people vote or not. Our TCNJ based poll found that 45% of Trump voters are very enthusiastic for voting for President Trump, while only 19% of Biden voters are very enthusiastic. And obviously these are young voters, which in general would have preferred Bernie Sanders to be the Democratic nominee among Democrats. Let's talk about this difference on a national level. In general, more people are excited to vote for Trump than vote for Biden from what we've seen recently. And this is for very excited, not just somewhat. So how do you think voter enthusiasm is going to affect this race? Let's start with Chris again.
Yeah, I think voter enthusiasm is a lot more, or it is a lot more of a factor in this election than the approval ratings, because at the end of the day, it's how much can you get people in your base and independent voters who don't like the other candidate to go out and vote. Because at the end of the day, votes matter. It doesn't polls. You can poll everyone but at the end of the day, are they going to go out and vote? And do you have the enthusiasm of people to go out and vote for you? So I think enthusiasm is probably the biggest factor in this election. Is somebody can be able to get their base and independent voters out to vote for them.
I think that as for voter enthusiasm, I think there's two different ways to look at it, right? I think there's kind of an online enthusiasm. I think the Democrats control the online enthusiasm. Twitter, Facebook, all social medias belong to the Democrats. That's why the Republican Party's kind of strange silent majority, right? That's what people always like to refer to the Republicans as. I don't actually think it's as prominent this election as it was last election, as in I don't think that this election will feature kind of a silent majority. I think the Democrats are a more enthusiastic base. I just think that's how it's always worked. I think Joe Biden makes them less enthusiastic because Joe Biden himself is not what he used to be. If you go and look at like the 2008 debates and look at his debates against Trump, or even just him public speaking, I'm sorry, it's not the same person. It does not look like the same person who was debating 10 years ago or who was speaking to a crowd 10 years ago. He's not enthusiastic. He acts confused. He gets messed up. He stumbles. To be expected, but he does it often, and it's not like what you want to look forward to. You don't look forward to watching that. People like Bernie Sanders. They got enthusiastic over Bernie Sanders, not only because he presented these progressive ideas, because he was like a cool, relatable candidate, right? He kind of was able to energize a base because of the fact that he fought for things. He literally fought for things that people actually believed in, which most of these candidates never have done in their life. And I think that's why Bernie Sanders was a more energetic candidate than Joe Biden. As for Trump, Trump's kind of an energetic candidate to his young base, just because he's Trump. You know, he says things that go to the top of his mind, and young people like that. Young people like seeing someone who's against the wave, and that's exactly what he does. So I think it's easy for young Trump supporters to be like, "Yeah, Trump, let's go." It's just how it works. So I think as for the 2020 election, we have Joe Biden, or the Democratic Party, as more energetic, and the Republican Party less energetic, but the people who support Trump definitely support Trump. They are out there and they were open about it.
Okay, so more energy, like more concentrated energy on the Republican side. Let's see what the Democrats have to say. Dave, what do you have to say about that?
Well, no one's enthusiastic to be a moderate. I don't go around if I'm a moderate and say, hey, I'm really enthusiastic to vote in this election. Typically, you have two choices and you're not a fan of either candidate, but you end up choosing the person that you think is more aligned with your ideology on a range of issues, right? So, to Tyler's point, Bernie's base was very enthusiastic. Bernie didn't have the moderate vote. Joe Biden was ranked, if you look at the lifetime rankings for bipartisanship in the Senate of living senators, which decreases every year because senators are so old. But if you look at the lifetime rankings, Joe Biden's in the top fifth of most bipartisan senators among living US senators. If you look at, say, Bernie Sanders, he's three from the bottom, right? So Bernie certainly was a polarizing candidate in the Democratic Party, and he certainly energized the base that hasn't really been active in Democratic Party politics, and he's gotten them engaged, which is tremendous. He was speaking to the issues of everyday people, and sometimes he was speaking to the lives of people who were in the Republican Party and felt like they had been left out. And Trump also speaks to that base. And to kind of Chris's point, Trump is speaking to voters who feel like they've been left behind for the past 30, 40 years. And so Trump's base is probably more enthusiastic, but the question is that going to be enough to get the moderates who are going to be voting in 2020?
To me, I think the enthusiasm is going to come from the younger voters. So I'll put a cap on it, 30 years or younger, which we fall into. I think it's important for people, especially for me, in the first time I'm voting in a presidential election. I think it's important to have as big of an outcome as many people vote as possible. So in a Tufts University study, compared to 2016, I know the circumstances were different, obviously, because we weren't in a global pandemic in 2016. But in battleground states, the early votes casted then to now. So for example, in Florida, 6 times as many votes were casted earlier. In North Carolina, 8 times as many, and in Michigan, almost 20 times as many votes casted early in a presidential election. So to me, my understanding of that is people are enthusiastic, they want their voice to be heard, and they want their president, who they're voting for, to represent them. So I think we'll call it the youth enthusiasm in this election is going to be the biggest factor in deciding who's the next president.
And just to follow up on that, do you think that it's on both sides? There's a lot of enthusiasm among young Republicans to vote for Trump and a lot of enthusiasm just to vote for a Democratic person, even if it is Joe Biden?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess polarized because I know more about the Democrat aspect of it, where I believe Democrats are more likely to be younger voters. But I think that either way, there's younger voters on both sides who are enthusiastic and eager to vote.
Let's move on to polling. Our TCNJ based poll found that 12.5% of voters will be voting for President Trump, while 76.9% will be voting for Vice President Biden. Only 3% and then less than 1% of TCNJ students say they will be voting for the Libertarian and Green Party, respectively. The data on the national level does show a different story, obviously. According to 538's average, on a national average, not state by state, but national, as of October 23rd, 42.4% planned for voting for President Trump, while 52% plan for voting for Vice President Biden. That's a 9.7% lead for Vice President Biden. Do you think the polls are right? Do you think they show an accurate depiction of what's going to happen this November? And who do you guys believe is going to win the election? Is it going to be President Donald J. Trump or Vice President Joseph R. Biden?
In interpreting these polls, I, as a Democrat, believe that Joe Biden, Vice President Biden, is going to be elected the next president. I think that gap in the polling percentage is significant. I think people are understanding what has happened in the past 4 years, that it didn't work out. It's not working out. And a lot of people don't want this to go on for another 4 years because, to be honest, I feel that the president has fallen a bit short on a lot of the promises that he's made, you know? So I think that people are wanting their voices to be heard and wanting a change. When it comes to polling, how accurate is it? 2016 comes to show that you never know. So obviously, I'm a little bit skeptical, as I'm sure everyone here is. I can't speak on all your behalfs, but after 2016, me personally, I become skeptical about polling. But I'm excited. I'm eager to vote, and I'm intrigued to see how accurate these polls might be, because if something happens like 2016 again, you never know in the future. You don't know who you could trust. You don't know how things are going to go. So I think that'll totally change the importance of polling in the U.S. Going forward if something else does happen like that.
Dave, are you as skeptical as Yanni, or are you a little bit more optimistic on these numbers?
Well, I'm certainly hoping that Joe Biden wins. So I'm a little hesitant to accept the numbers that look a little too good to be true. But if you look at, and Ferris, you were talking earlier about Nate Silver and 538. If you look at 538, what we see is in their simulation of 40,000 iterations of what this election might look like based on their polling, they have Biden winning 87% of the time, and they have Trump winning about 13% of the time. And Trump's chances are basically lower than rolling a one on a die. So we'll see. I think that we have to be hesitant with the numbers that we're looking at from polls. And of course, there are going to be Trump voters, and this is a moot point, especially amongst Democrats, but I think it's probably true. There is a group of voters who won't identify as Trump voters until they're in the ballot booth, and then they'll vote for Donald Trump. And that's what I think Yanni was speaking to. We have to be hesitant as Democrats about that.
I'm sure that the Republicans are also skeptical and hesitant to trust the national polls. Chris, what do you have to say about that?
I think that in terms of polls, I think that when you look at national polls, it's harder to get a good depiction of where the race is going, just based on how our electoral system works. Our electoral system doesn't work on a majority rules of whoever gets a majority of the votes wins. It's on a state by state basis. So I think to get a clearer depiction of where the race is going, it's better to look at state polls. And really, when you look back at 2016, the state polls weren't really that wrong. Most of them, at least with the swing states, most of them were within margin of error. So I think that it's better to look at more of the swing states. But also, even with polls in the swing states, you also get those people that just don't want to identify themselves as, they might have a bunch of family members that are in a different party than they are, and they don't really want to put themselves out there saying that they are voting for the opposite party that some of their friends or family members are. So really, at the end of the day, polling isn't the greatest showing of the way a race is going, but I think that a better way of polling is looking at individual states versus national polls.
And who do you believe is going to win? Do you think President Donald Trump is going to be reelected?
I think that Donald Trump will be reelected.
Tyler, do you agree?
No, but I kind of want to take a different approach to this question.
Go
if
ahead.
That's okay. So first of all, I think there's a big difference between 2016 and 2020. There's a couple. First of all, mail-in ballots. That was we've had we've had millions of mail-in ballots casted already, which really wasn't a thing in 2016, at least to this degree. I think it gives voters more room to, go out and vote, because on election day, it's not a national holiday. People are working. They can't always get to the polls. However, this year, they can, because they just have to send it through the mail. I also think it kind of decreases this idea of voter suppression that exists when you have to go out to the polling places. But I can't be certain about that. There's also a couple differences in this election. So something I just kind of want to say, I'm going to butcher this, but there's a Supreme Court case in July. It was called Schiaffolo, I don't know how to say it, versus Washington. And it basically said that you can't have faithless electors. You can't have these electoral college members in these states going against the popular vote in their state. So they have to vote along the lines of the popular vote, which will play a role in this election, because even if Trump lost the popular vote in Washington, but he got the electors. That can't happen anymore. Those electors have to go with the popular vote that was in that state, which will play a role in this election and all future elections. It kind of opens up the sphere for a national popular vote instead of an electoral college, which was the goal of this case. And it's kind of surprising that the Supreme Court actually went that way in their decision. But I don't actually think, as for polls, I don't really think, like, I'm not a big fan of polls because I think you're pulling from so many different places. These national polls aren't that accurate. They never have been. State polls are more accurate. I'll agree. They kind of give a better depiction of what's going to happen. But for national polls, I don't think it's going to play a difference. So as for who's going to win, I think at this point, Joe Biden's going to win the election, particularly because I think these mail-in ballots that are going in, at least from what I've read, are mostly Joe Biden because he's the one pushing for these mail-in ballots. You have Trump on one side, like, oh, there's issues with them. They're fraudulent. Don't use them. Go to the polls. But you have Joe Biden, like, yeah, guys, come on, do both. Go to the polls and use these mail-in ballots, which gives his voters more opportunity to vote. So I think we're gonna see a Joe Biden win.
I'd like to clarify that neither candidate is asking people to vote twice on an actual serious level. Just to make sure, Joe Biden nor Donald Trump are like seriously asking people to vote twice. That's a felony. Don't do
I didn't
that.
mean I didn't mean vote twice. I meant just like use either or.
All right, so this is where we're going to stop for this part one of TCNJ Decision 2020. I'd like to thank both the young Republicans and Democrats for joining us. Make sure to watch the second part.